If we're carrying on our analogies of kind of dating, marriage.
And VK, sorry, I'm going to continue. I know you normally cut us off, and feel free to mute me if you think I'm rambling at any point.
So there's a lot of consensus views out there, which we probably have fueled as well, which won't happen. And if you want to really succeed, you probably want to be non-consensus.
I think we try to flip it around and actually say, if the founding team can do a great job of wowing us on a Zoom call, what does that mean about what they're really like in person? And try to give them almost extra credit for doing well in a video conference environment.
Okay.
You shouldn't be, because experience counts for a lot, as you can see from my grey hat. If we're carrying on our analogies of kind of dating, marriage, which we've been doing throughout the season, I guess this is the kind of question about biological clocks ticking or something, is it equivalent to startups? I'm a big believer you can't force either being an entrepreneur or having ideas. Ideas will come to you. We have mentioned before, I think it's probably true, unfortunately, that the venture industry can be a bit ageist. But we shouldn't be, because experience counts for a lot, as you can see from my grey hat. So I don't think you can force it. If you have a good idea, no matter whether you're 30, 40, 20, go for it.
I was thinking, Rogan, to our portfolio and the youngest and the oldest founder that we've backed. So we've definitely backed founders in their mid to late 40s in the past. And then we've also backed founders in their mid to late 20s. So I would say if I had to hazard a guess, and this is without properly crunching the data, the average founder we back is probably 31, 32, 33, somewhere in the early 30s, which means they've had a decent amount of work experience. They've had enough kind of knowledge of a specific sector, and they've experienced the frustration of what's going wrong in a sector long enough to decide, I'm going to do something about it.
If we start using data, I bet you'll find that the younger founders got us the best returns. We're going to start using that to be ageist ourselves.
I'm not sure that's true, actually. Small giant games, definitely not young founders. Oh, I want to jump in here, VK, because this always reminds me of my favorite quote, and it's probably an apocryphal quote and not true, but supposedly the head of the commissioner of the U.S. Patent Office in 1899 proposed shutting it down because he said everything that can be invented has been invented, and he was proven, if he actually said it, proven wrong many, many times over. I do think what's true is that we've had a few waves in the venture capital world, starting with kind of semiconductor wave, the PC wave in the 80s, and now the mobile wave for the last 10 to 15 years. So it's not going to be that drives it, but there are going to be other platform innovations that take place. And maybe it's AR, VR, although we've been hearing about that for a while. Maybe it's the AI-led revolution as well. It could be, theoretically, the COVID-19 led revolution as well. And all the kind of creative destruction that's taking place right now could lead to a new wave of innovation.
Or the Internet of Things or Bitcoin. I mean, there's always going to be new things. And definitely not everything's been done. And in fact, I think one of the biggest things that COVID will do is it will force behavioural change, which will therefore force changes in businesses. You don't have to be a tech founder. I mean, pro-founders invest in tech, but there are lots of very successful non-tech businesses. But I think that, I don't know whether this is a kind of question about low code and no code, and to the extent to which you can stop businesses without having a technology background. I think that we've seen this for a long time, that it's not, you don't need to be, if you're doing an e-commerce business, there are a load of tools out there which don't require high-tech knowledge. But if you want to be doing an innovative business in either a blockchain or drones or connected cars, you probably do need to have a tech founder. We always like that.
Here's a question for you. Is it easier, I was trying to think through this, is it easier to recruit business people to a very tech-heavy team, or vice versa, to bring tech people into a very business-heavy team? And what would we favor if we could only pick, if we had to choose between those two as a team?
I think VK's supposed to be asking the questions because that's quite a difficult one. I think that you of course can. The difficulty either way is not actually in finding the people, it's making sure that they can mix. And so I just give you the same answer backwards and forwards, as in, if the tech people understand that business is important, that's great, they'll be able to do it. If business people understand that tech is important, they'll be able to do it. I'd probably start with tech, but I'd want somebody who had a business mind.
I guess the question about has it become fierce, that would probably be true up until about 3 months ago. All of our companies across the board are seeing much cheaper kind of click costs on Facebook and Google and all the other platforms, because there's a lot of companies out there that are struggling, that have had to pull back on budgets. Frankly, we, the VCs, broadly, the last couple, 2 to 3 to 4 years, actually funded a lot of the market cap of Facebook and Google by funding these companies to spend on acquisition on those platforms. But I would say every one of our companies, they do use these digital means to acquire customers, but that's actually meant to be the first port of entry, and all of them absolutely build out other acquisition methods and tools to acquire customers. And it's great because it's easy to dial up and down the digital spend, but every company must be able to broaden their acquisition methodology.
And broadly speaking, it's more and more difficult to innovate on tactics about acquiring marketing more efficiently. So for me, it's an obsession of mine, is the focus really should be, right, once we've got people in, what can we do with them? Either in terms of extending their lifetime value with us, i.e. reducing churn, or by getting them to be advocates for our services, and therefore getting more word of mouth and organic traffic.
Well, exactly, VK. We talk about this almost every day internally, and we try to assess kind of where we should be looking as a fund over the next few years. And so I think we don't have a 100% answer yet on the sectors. I mean, we can understand how COVID is affecting different sectors. We're now trying to assess what is the opportunity within those different sectors, right? So future of work, telemedicine, et cetera, et cetera. I think the broad thesis that we're all operating under, though, is that this is actually, frankly, a very good time for innovation. And part of it is because people and companies are more willing and more open to try new innovative things, right? They have to, in a world in which we operate, be willing to experiment a little bit. And we see the take-up of, in the US, online shopping, the take-up of telemedicine here in the UK, the situation within, for example, companies trying to get NHS contracts going from 9 months process down to a 3-week tender process. And so there is huge opportunity out there.
But let's face it, okay, you're right, a lot's been written. As investors, and probably actually as entrepreneurs as well, it almost pays to be non-consensus. So I always worry when somebody goes out there and goes, right, yeah, COVID means nobody's going to be working in offices anymore, therefore we're only going to look at remote working, because clearly that's not going to be the case. So there's a lot of consensus views out there, which we probably have fueled as well, which won't happen. And if you want to really succeed, you probably want to be non-consensus.
Well, I mean, clearly in the last 15 years, there's been a democratization of the kind of the startup process, right? I think, number one, it's become quite trendy and cool. So there's more role models out there that you can point to, and more, successful founders in Europe that can be kind of visible leaders to the space. On top of that, the costs of initially setting up a company has dropped dramatically the last 10 to 15 years. If you harken back to 2005, when I first moved to Europe, the companies were raising millions and millions because they needed to invest in servers, in computers. There was no Amazon Web Services. Even on the marketing side, the Google advertising sort of platform wasn't as developed as it is right now. There was no Facebook to do acquisition. So it was just much more expensive across the board. And so because it's much cheaper now, it's easier to do, and the cost of failure is a little bit lower in the early days. So yes, I would say, I could hazard a guess, but the number of companies being set up is 4, 5, 6x what it was even 10 years ago.
But if I nuance the question a bit, so yes, there are more companies raising. That doesn't necessarily mean there's more competition. Because if all the other companies raising aren't high enough quality, actually that doesn't necessarily compete with A. B, if they're all focusing on one area and you're focusing on a different area, there's less competition. So I think that, again, a good team with a good idea, not just a Me Too product, will actually have less competition in the overall.
And VK, sorry, I'm going to continue. I know you normally cut us off, and feel free to mute me if you think I'm rambling at any point. But your available audience as well is dramatically bigger than it was 10 or 15 years ago, right? So the size of the opportunity you're going against, the number of people online now is close to 4.5, 5 billion or so, whereas 10 years ago it was probably close to 1 billion or so. And so it's much bigger market. It's all relative. Relative to 6 months ago, heck yeah, there's a lot less VC money available. That's because angels are probably a little bit scared right now. They're pulling back. The VC funds like ProFounders and the others, number one, have to go through and think about the reserve allocation for each one of their companies and how difficult fundraising might be for companies in the future. A lot of VCs will have pressure from their investors to slow down the investment pace. And I suspect corporate VCs will pull back because investing into loss-making early-stage tech startups is probably not great for the quarterly results that they're all feeling pressure for. However, compared to 4 or 5 years ago, it's up dramatically. So it's all about your time frame and horizon.
I mean, there's an obviously, if there's maybe a little bit less people raising, and but there's less money out there available, as Sean said. Obviously, that suggests that the bar should be higher. There's a different reason I think the bar's higher, which is all of us as investors now can actually step back and not be rushed into things, which I feel there was last year, a huge rushing into or being forced to rush into things. And whereas last year people might have gone, oh, we won't bother with that piece of DD, or we won't, that concern would just have to overlook. I think people are now looking into them. And so actually what we're doing is going back to be doing what we should be doing anyhow, which is actually adding some rigor to our investment thesis. So a consequence of slower investment processes, which is definitely happening, partly because of doing things by video conference, but mainly just because of less urgency, means that the bar is higher.
The fragility of maybe some of those supply chains, whether that's through multi-sourcing or onshoring or whatever it might be. But to come back to what Rogan said, at times you have to be a little contrarian as well. And this could be a good time if no one else is looking at anything related to travel. Travel will come back. How it comes back is a question, but there's opportunity within that as well.
Well, let me say something else. If we only invested, or if people only invested in companies that benefit from COVID-19, I don't think you're going to make money, because COVID-19, and I'm not a doctor, but it is not going to be around. It's not going to be the only thing that affects the world for the next 10 years, which should be at least our time horizon. So as a strategy, if I only go into things that are directly affected by COVID-19, I will not make money. So I've got to be looking at things which are adversely affected as well at the moment, with the view that the world's changing.
The short
way more
answer.
difficult to pitch. I mean, we've just demonstrated brilliantly by face-to-face meetings, because you can see what the other person's going to do, you can sense it, whereas you can't online. So I think it's actually way more difficult for entrepreneurs to pitch us, and all of us, entrepreneurs, but also VCs, need to come to a kind of new conventions about how we don't put up our hand or whatever. You should definitely not wait if you need to raise, because otherwise you're going to just screw up your business. I'm a big believer that that you kind of know when the right time to raise is, and you should just do it then.
Yeah. I mean, let's be honest, this is a terrible medium with which to communicate. Now, we're all trying to make the best of it as we can, but it's really, really tough, and it is really unfair on entrepreneurs, because basically every meeting, if you will, is almost a job interview on both sides. It's about the VCs getting comfortable with the founders, about the founders getting comfortable with the VCs as well. I think we've tried to flip it around and actually say, if the founding team can do a great job of wowing us on a Zoom call, what does that mean about what they're really like in person? And try to give them almost extra credit for doing well in a video conference environment.
I mean, I don't think so, but others do. I mean, for me, I don't get why it should do, because they're another investor, it's money coming in. If you look at, I think we mentioned it before, but countries like Finland, where there is kind of state loans that go in. They don't have any impact at all. They just extend your runway without diluting, which is great. This does dilute. But I don't see any problem. And for me, it's not a signaling to say, oh my God, you were unable to raise elsewhere. I think it's you could raise, and then you decide to raise more without any extra effort, which is
so Rogan, we've been told repeatedly that these are more fun when we disagree. So I'm going to play devil's advocate here. If you're going to future fund, it's because you couldn't raise externally, you couldn't get another new investor, and you had to go back to the existing and get some government money on top of it.
Well, it doesn't have to be existing. It could be a new investor as well, couldn't it? Future fund.
It is. I'd love to see the numbers. So I think they've said 50 companies have raised from the future fund so far. That'd be fascinating. They should publish how many of those were internal rounds versus external rounds, and then we'll get a real sense of whether or not this is basically state aid to support companies that would otherwise struggle.
Well, just want to extend the runway. We'll see. As it's government, they probably will have to release the conflict.
I don't think the bar is higher. I actually think it's easier to convince someone to try something new. I think when you're in a corporate kind of stuffy environment and you have authorizations and approval processes and tender processes, it's very tricky. I think when people are stuck at home, there's a lot more freedom and leeway they've got to do new things now. And so I'm actually quite encouraged by the general acceptance to new products and new experiences that we're seeing through this.
But having said which, actually, companies are, by necessity, going to be less risk averse at this current time because they've got all these other risks from the economy, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think there's an element of trying to persuade a company to do something new is going to be quite difficult. I think consumers probably are always quite open to doing things new, but if there is an economic downturn, the major factor is not going to be, is this new or is this old? It's how much is it going to cost me? Because, not surprisingly, in an economic downturn, that's the thing that kind of it is of greatest effect. And so if you can go along to a company and say, here's a new thing, and they start to look a little bit depressed, which will save you X amount of money guaranteed, they're likely to change more then. If you go along and say, here's a new thing, it's really going to improve your sales, but it's going to cost you X amount of extra money, they're probably going to say no, irrespective of COVID or not.
Yes, you have to. Because as much as I said people are trying new things, Rogan was right that companies aren't, they don't have the budgets right now, let's be honest. So they're not making purchasing decisions. So you might be able to generate traction and usage for your product. Whether you can generate revenue from that is a kind of a...
I don't know if you can be more forgiving. I mean, the reality is that when we say, for example, we want to see some commercial traction, that talks to the risk that we're prepared to take. And in that case, we're saying we want to take the risk we want to take is not that somebody will take it, but we know some people will take it. The risk we want to take is how much you can scale. There's a different set of risks and a different set of valuations and probably a different set of investors who go, we've got a product, it hasn't got any traction yet, but we think it can do because of a bunch of commercial terms. So I think what actually happens, VK, is that if people haven't managed to sell because of COVID-19, they're going to be at an earlier stage, they're going to be a higher risk company, and therefore the valuation they can command, and probably the people they are talking to, is going to be a different bunch than if they had made the sale.
But Rogan, the follow-on from that, from an venture fund's perspective is, it sounds like you should either invest very early, where you can afford to give away the product or generate those first proof points over the next year and a half, or invest much later stage, where companies have kind of proper heft and weight and a sales playbook in place. And you can be kind of stuck in the middle there.
It depends where. I mean, we usually say we want a little bit of traction, but obviously if there's a load of traction, then it will be beyond our meager means.
No, I meant more broadly speaking, not just pro founders, from the broader kind of investment community where they should focus. I mean, I think it's not a dirty secret that all those things cost less than they probably did 6 months ago or so, right? We already see with companies hiring, guess what? The people aren't quite as expensive as they were 4 or 5 months ago. We find recruiters are willing to have a slight cut on fees. Lawyers are willing to put caps at lower amounts. Everyone's being quite flexible now. So I think the money does stretch a little bit further, But there's also, as Rogan touched on, there's not so much pressure, I think, right now to grow as quickly as you did before. So you can be more thoughtful in your hiring pace, more thoughtful in the rate at which you spend on marketing, and you can stretch the money that way.
Also, without sounding like a bit clanky, but as Sean said, but this is about kind of where you're comparing it with. If you're comparing it with the cost bases of last year, they were out of kilter anyhow. So people were overspending. I mean, a lot of the companies that we speak to and we invest in who have unfortunately had to let people go have not actually seen a marked difference in their output. And so I'd say that I'd actually turn that around and say last year people had bloated cost bases.